Hi, we are on to video 12, and I apologize for calling our last video 10 over and over again. I just can't retain numbers in my head. So today, David. Now, King David gets a promise very similar to Abraham that I want to emphasize before I tell you the David story. Abraham was promised that from his descendants, the one who is going to rule forever would come. That means that Jesus, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus has to be a blood relative of Abraham. The exact same thing happens with David. When David gets his covenant with God, he is said to be the one who's going to produce the Messiah, okay? So hold on to that. So the David story is about 990 years pre-Christ. Now, we have the Israelites. They wandered in the desert. They made it to the promised land. And when they're in the promised land, they are ruled by judges. They do not have a king. The people begin to want a king because a king is a very powerful political figure. And the prophet Samuel warns them, you guys do not want a king. Because yeah, the idea of a king is great, but kings can become tyrants. And ultimately, that's exactly what the people get. They get warned. They don't want to hear the information. They want to do things the way they want to do it. And they get Saul. Saul is, he is essentially that. He's a tyrant. He's overbearing. He looks the part of this great mighty king, but he does not possess kindness or fairness. So what Samuel ends up doing is going to look for a new king, one chosen by God. And he goes to Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is also where Jesus is born. So this is where David is found. Now, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and he meets all of Jesse's sons. Usually what happens is the firstborn son is the one that becomes king. He is seen to be as like the diamond of the family, the firstborn males. What happens here though is unique because when Samuel meets the sons, he's like, none of these men are the right men. Do you have any more sons? And yes, Jesse does. He has one that is out tending sheep. And because David, the one out tending sheep, is so meek and small and the youngest, Jesse didn't even bother to have him meet Samuel because he was like, there's no way he would pick this guy. Well, he does. He chooses David, who is essentially Saul's opposite. Now, Saul had fallen out of favor with God because he didn't obey orders that he was given. And Saul becomes tormented by like an evil spirit, basically. And he hires a musician to play music to soothe him of this spirit. The musician happens to be David. So David plays the harp for him. And Saul is just like, wow, this boy is incredible. And Saul's son, Jonathan, becomes friends with him as well. Now, at one point in battle with the Philistines, David is tasked with bringing food to the soldiers. And while he's doing that, he sees that the Philistines have this great giant of a man, Goliath, and none of Saul's army is able to defeat him. David, again, this tiny young boy, he takes his slingshot and he hits Goliath with a stone and kills him. And so this gets a lot of notoriety for David, and Saul is becoming quite jealous. So not only is this kid best friends with Saul's son, but he's gaining all of this positive praise. What Saul does is he puts David at the front lines of the wars that he's waging. And this is something that we're going to hear about again. Somebody else is going to do this in this video. But David doesn't die when he's put at the front of the wars. He actually excels. And this is to Saul's dismay. So for about 8 years in the story, what we see is David running all over the place and Saul basically chasing him, trying to kill him. Now, I'm shortening this story greatly, okay? But David was an amazing political king and a liturgical king. The way that David actually gets to become king is Saul dies in battle with the Philistines. David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he chooses not to, okay? Again, this is the opposite of who Saul is. He chooses not to kill Saul, but Saul dies in battle. David becomes king. And He does amazing things. So he brings the Ark of the Covenant, which when the Israelites wandered in the desert, you have to remember that like the temple and the synagogue were the focal point for Jews. They didn't have that when they were in the desert because they were wandering. And so they built the tabernacle that had the Ark of the Covenant that has housed manna, that bread from heaven, Aaron's rod, the stone, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, and that was essentially their mobile temple. David brings that to Jerusalem and establishes it as the capital of Israel. He also brings peace to all of those neighboring areas that were at war with Saul. And, all of these things are a huge, huge deal. How do I emphasize this? Okay, so essentially what happens is David unites the 12 tribes. We talked in the last video about how Jesus picks 12 apostles, which is another type of typology of what's happening in this David story. What we see is just like David begins to bring unity to these groups of people, Christ will ultimately bring unity to the entire world, not just these nations, okay? So David and God make a covenant with one another. And this is the very most important portion of the David story that I need you guys to remember once we hit the New Testament. So just like with Abraham, what David is told by God is, your son will build God's temple. He is going to also bring about the Son of God, and the son that is going to come from your lineage is going to rule Israel forever. This ultimately, we know, becomes Jesus. Now, David has a son, Samuel, who is the one that builds the new temple. Now, here's the issue. Samuel builds an incredible temple for God, but then he makes his own home even more amazing. So we continue to see this. This is kind of like the theme that goes through the Old Testament, is people with a relationship with God, and then people become selfish or do something for themselves. It's kind of how we do. And David does this also. What David does is, even though he is this vibrant warrior, okay, and he goes out and he's unifying all these nations, he can't lose, basically. He becomes lazy. He goes into his palace, his troops are off fighting, and he stays behind. After a nap, he wakes up and he looks out his window and he sees a woman bathing. Now, this ritualistic bathing, we actually hear a little bit of this in the beginning of the Gospels. What people would do is they'd had to do ritual baths to cleanse themselves of sin. So it's kind of like what our baptism is in a way, like that washing away of sin, except they did it over and over again. So women, anytime they had intercourse or their period, they had to do ritualistic cleansing. And so David is looking out his window and he sees a woman bathing herself, and he is so captivated with her that he calls her to him and gets her pregnant. Now, she is married. What does David do? Well, he learned a lesson from when Saul was trying to kill him. So he takes Bathsheba's husband and puts him on the front lines where he dies. So this is where we get that break in the covenant. David had a part of a bargain to hold up. He was supposed to be living this righteous way of life, and he breaks it out of lust and essentially power, because he had the power to kill Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. Now, the book of Psalms is written by David. So even though he screwed up, David is a very important figure, because again, we were going to come to learn that Jesus is his descendant. David wrote the book of Psalms. Now, the book of Psalms is pretty remarkable. It's the longest book of the Bible, but this book is actually broken apart into 5 books. So chapters 1 through 41, we call this book 1, is the entire time Saul's trying to kill David. So this is David's prayer journal, and this first portion, chapters 1 through 41, are very sad and anxious, because all David's doing is running, trying not to die. Could you imagine having to run for 8 years and somebody is quite literally hot on your tail trying to kill you? That's what we see in the beginning of the Psalms. The book 2 of Psalms, chapters 42 through 72, is when David captures Jerusalem. It's a very joyous book. Following is book 3. Chapters 73 through 89 are the most depressing because this kingdom that David's established becomes divided. Book 4, chapters 90 through 106 is our exile, which is very, very sad portion of the Psalms also. But then book 5 becomes very praiseworthy, very, very joyous, because chapters 107 through 150, the temple is being rebuilt. And when we look at the Psalms, we need to also recognize this is David's prayer journal, okay? So when we read it, we need to be cautious because we know this is written by a man who is dealing with someone trying to murder him, a lot of joy, a lot of sadness. It is someone's prayer journal. So when we read this, we're not supposed to read it as in, this is what the Lord is commanding me to do. Again, you have to know what you're reading. But there are a couple things that are in the Psalms that I want to point out, because our next person that we're going to talk about is Daniel. And Daniel predicts Christ coming. David is also a predictor of Christ. So first, I want to read in Psalm 89. This is where God's covenant with David is written down. And what it says, so this is chapter 89. It says, and remember, David's writing this, I will sing of your mercies, O Lord, forever. With my mouth I will proclaim, for your merciful love was established forever. Your faithfulness is firm as the heavens. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn David my servant. I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. So this is pretty important. This is where we're talking about the one who's going to rule forever is going to be a blood relative to you, David, okay? Now, most of us will recall that when Jesus was on the cross and he dies, what he yells at the end, what he proclaims right before his death is different. In John, it is finished. He just says, it is finished, and he dies. He hands over his spirit. And in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's what Jesus says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is super confusing if you don't know what we're talking about. So when people would quote the Psalms, a lot of times they would just say the first line. That's what Christ does on the cross. He is quoting chapter 22 of the Psalms. Now this is a little long, so I'm going to read it to you and bear with me. But Jesus shouts this psalm that, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because what he is saying is, all of you Jews who are surrounding me, remember Psalm 22. And so this is how it goes. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praise of Israel. In your fathers they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted, and they were not disappointed. But I am worn and no man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He committed his cause to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb and kept me safe upon my mother's breast. Upon you I cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there's none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and lay me in dust of death. Yes, dogs are around me, a company of evildoers encircle me. Okay, pay real close attention here too. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all of my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So this continues. Psalm 22 continues. David wrote this, And essentially, what David wrote is the crucifixion of Jesus. Does David get his hands and feet pierced? He doesn't. Who does? Christ. Do they take his clothing, divide it among them, and cast lots to see who gets it? No. That's what happens to Jesus right before he's crucified. They strip him of his clothing because you are crucified naked, because not only is it meant to be excruciatingly painful, you mean to embarrass the person. So not only is it embarrassing enough to be killed in front of everybody, but they strip you completely naked and shame you in the process. And that's what David's writing about. David is predicting what happens to Christ. And so when Jesus on the cross cries out from David, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He is reminding the people of what David wrote in his prayer journal. So what I want from this video for you is I want you to point out the moments of typology, the moments where we get glimpses of Christ. Okay, so that's the big one. The other thing I want recorded is what was so important about David. Okay, just pull those out, write them down, and that's it. So our next one is actually my favorite. We're going to talk about Daniel. And I think that you guys will find that very interesting, because ultimately what we are unpacking here is, why do we believe Jesus is God? If I came up to you and I said, "Hi guys, I'm God, please worship me," you guys are not going to do it. Okay, so why do you worship Jesus? And if the answer is because my mom told me that he is God, that's not a good answer. We gotta understand why we believe Jesus to be who he is. Okay, so next up is going to be video 13, and we'll talk about Daniel. Thanks, guys.